Have you ever wondered what unspeakable horrors might be lurking beneath the earth, waiting for the right moment to be discovered? Deep in the remote and ominous surroundings of the Black Forest, a group of workers, led by Victor Tavares, a seasoned geological engineer, began an excavation that would forever change their lives. Victor wasn't a stranger to the dark, lonely places of the world. He had drilled through mountains, uncovered hidden caverns, and faced the perils of the underground more times than he could count. But nothing could have prepared him for what lay beneath the soil of that forsaken site. The digging started like any other. The deafening roar of machinery filled the forest, and the cool, damp smell of freshly turned earth mixed with the scent of pine needles from the dense forest surrounding them. Hours passed until, suddenly, the drills hit something unexpected, something that wasn't rock or mineral. It was soft, almost fleshy, and the machines shuddered to a stop. Victor approached the excavation site, curiosity gnawing at him. He peered into the darkness, the unearthed object barely visible in the dim lighting of the work lamps. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't just a strange texture. It was something alive, something old, an entity slumbering deep in the earth. The air turned cold as the workers gathered around. There was a collective sense of unease, an instinctual fear, as if their bodies knew they had crossed a line that should never have been touched. Victor could feel his heart pounding, a heavy thud in the stillness of the moment. The shape was grotesque, covered in a thick, pulsating membrane, veins of an unnatural black branching out under the surface. As if sensing their presence, the shape seemed to twitch, a movement so slight that Victor questioned his sanity. "Did anyone else see that?" he muttered, his voice barely audible over the eerie silence that had suddenly settled upon the site. The other workers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging worried glances. One of them, Joao, nodded, his face pale under the work lamps. "It had moved," he stammered, eyes wide, unable to look away from the abomination they had uncovered. There was something deeply wrong about that place. The earth itself seemed to exude a dark energy, a heavy pressure that settled into Victor's bones, whispering at the edges of his consciousness that they needed to leave, and fast. But as they stood there, transfixed by the horrid discovery, a pungent stench began to rise from the hole. It was a smell like rot, like something ancient and decayed. It clawed at their throats, making their eyes water. Victor stepped back, trying to shake off the nausea, but the feeling that they had awakened something that should have remained buried, only grew stronger. It was a dread that went beyond the physical, a deep, inexplicable fear that gnawed at his mind, as though 1,000 eyes were suddenly watching them from the shadows. If you want to know what happened next, if you're ready to follow Victor and his crew as they face an unimaginable terror, then don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. What they uncovered beneath the earth will defy all logic and sanity. And let me warn you, some things are better left undisturbed. That first night after the discovery, Victor found it impossible to sleep. The smell of the excavation, that rancid stench, seemed to cling to his skin, his clothes, even his mind. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and he fell into a restless slumber. But as soon as his eyes closed, the nightmare began. He found himself back at the site, standing alone under a sky that was unnaturally dark, with no stars, no moon, only an oppressive void. The work lamps flickered in the distance, casting long, shifting shadows over the excavation pit. He could hear something, a low, rhythmic sound like breathing, slow, deliberate, and somehow conscious. Victor stepped closer to the pit, the ground beneath him feeling different, almost as if it were breathing too, pulsing with each of his steps. He wanted to turn back, every fiber of his being screamed at him to wake up, to run, but he was drawn to the hole, a compulsion he couldn't resist. As he approached, he noticed a thick fog beginning to spill out of the pit, curling around his feet, chilling him to the bone. The fog seemed alive, moving with a purpose, whispering in a language he couldn't understand, but felt somewhere deep inside, resonating with a primitive, primal fear. Then he saw it. Eyes, faintly glowing in the darkness, staring back at him from the depths of the hole. They weren't human. They were vast, impossibly old, and filled with a knowing malice. They blinked, and in that split second, Victor saw visions, flashes of people screaming, their faces twisted in agony, their minds broken, their bodies contorted in unnatural poses. He saw the workers from his team, Joao among them, each of them staring blankly, their hands clawing at their own faces as if trying to tear away something unseen. The vision passed, and Victor was again staring at the pit, the eyes still watching him, closer now, rising from the darkness. He felt frozen, his legs like lead, his voice caught in his throat. A sound rose from the pit, a whisper at first, then a chorus, 1,000 voices overlapping, each promising something different: power, knowledge, escape. But beneath it all was the promise of destruction, of madness. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him, and the air turned heavy, making it difficult to breathe. Suddenly, Victor felt something cold wrap around his ankle, a hand, bony and decayed, clawing its way out of the earth, pulling him closer to the edge. Panic surged through him. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped. He looked down and saw more hands, skeletal and covered in that same black, pulsing membrane, grasping at him from the fog. The terror was overwhelming, a suffocating blanket that filled his lungs, his thoughts. He was being dragged into the pit, into the darkness, where those eyes waited. Victor woke up with a jolt, drenched in sweat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, he didn't know where he was, the darkness of his room feeling just as heavy and suffocating as the nightmare. He sat up, trying to shake off the feeling, but something was wrong. The room felt colder, the air too still. He glanced at his ankle, half expecting to see marks, and there it was, a faint bruise, shaped like the skeletal fingers from his dream. His heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him. This was no ordinary nightmare. It was a warning, or maybe a promise of what was yet to come. The next day, Victor couldn't shake the feeling of dread. His colleagues noticed his pallor, the exhaustion that lined his face. Joao, especially, seemed different, his gaze distant, as if he was somewhere else entirely. The dreams had begun for them too. Victor could see it in their haunted eyes. Whatever they had awakened was not just in the pit. It was in their minds, and it was growing stronger. As the days passed, the strange occurrences at the excavation site only intensified. Victor felt as if he were moving through a fog, his senses dulled, every shadow seeming to stretch longer, darker, and more ominous. It wasn't just him. The entire crew had become silent, their usual banter replaced by hushed murmurs and fearful glances. There was something about the air. It was heavy, filled with an electric charge that made the hair on Victor's arms stand on end. It felt like the forest around them was watching, the ancient trees bending closer, as if they were part of the dark secret they had unearthed. One afternoon, while Victor was inspecting the machinery, he noticed Joao standing near the pit again. He was staring at it, unblinking, his lips moving in what appeared to be a silent prayer or incantation. Victor approached, the feeling of dread intensifying with each step. "Joao," he called out, his voice sounding strange in the thickened air, like it was swallowed by the earth itself. Joao did not respond. Victor touched his shoulder, and Joao flinched violently, his eyes wide and glassy, filled with terror. "It wants us," Joao whispered, his voice hoarse, as if he'd been screaming for hours. "It won't let us leave." Later that night, Victor sat alone in his tent, the cold creeping in despite the fire outside. He tried to write a report, something to make sense of what was happening, but his mind felt fragmented, as if pieces of his memory were being stolen away. The whispers had returned, faint at first, barely perceptible over the rustling of the forest, but growing louder, more insistent. He could hear words now, though they were in a language he didn't understand, yet it was disturbingly familiar, like a lullaby from his childhood twisted into something dark and malignant. Suddenly, a loud noise broke the silence, a scream that pierced through the night. Victor rushed out of his tent, his heart pounding. The rest of the crew were already gathered near the pit. One of the workers, Carlos, was on his knees, his hands covered in blood, staring blankly at the ground. Victor pushed through the crowd, his eyes widening in horror as he saw what had happened. There at Carlos' feet lay a small animal, a rabbit, its body mutilated, its eyes wide open, reflecting the work lamps with an empty stare. Carlos looked up at Victor, tears streaming down his face. "It told me to," he sobbed, his voice cracking. "It said it was the only way to stop the visions." The realization hit Victor like a blow to the chest. Whatever they had awakened wasn't just affecting their dreams. It was taking control, feeding on their fear, their sanity, driving them to acts they could not comprehend. The boundary between reality and nightmare had begun to blur. The line that separated the waking world from whatever malevolence lay beneath them growing thinner with each passing hour. Victor knew they needed to leave, abandon the site, but it was as if an unseen force was keeping them there, binding them to the excavation. He tried to contact the headquarters for an evacuation order, but the radio emitted nothing but static, a low, grating noise that seemed to form words if he listened for too long. He could almost hear his name being whispered through the static, a beckoning voice, calling him back to the pit. As darkness fell, the fog returned, thicker than before, swallowing the lights and casting the entire site into an eerie twilight. Shapes moved within the mist, shifting just out of sight, their forms indistinct but unmistakably real. Victor watched as João wandered into the fog, his figure disappearing into the thick gloom. He called out, but his voice felt weak, powerless against the overwhelming sense of dread that filled the camp. Moments later, he saw João again, standing at the edge of the pit, staring down into the darkness. Only this time, it wasn't João who looked back. It was something else, using João's eyes, something ancient and filled with malice. Victor felt his breath catch, his pulse racing. He could no longer deny it. Whatever lay beneath them was awake now, and it was reaching out, twisting their minds, using their fears to break them. The creature they had uncovered wasn't just some relic of the past. It was something far worse, something that thrived on their terror, that found delight in watching them crumble from within. And as Victor stood there, he knew that the true horror was only just beginning. That night, Victor couldn't resist the pull of sleep. It felt as if invisible hands were closing his eyes, dragging him down into the depths of his own mind, into that dark place where the nightmares awaited. He found himself back at the excavation site once again, but everything was wrong. The fog had thickened, a suffocating shroud that blocked out the stars and muffled all sound. Victor felt the cold biting into his skin, colder than he had ever felt before, and he knew, deep down, that he was not alone. He turned slowly, his heart thudding in his chest, and there it was, rising from the pit. The creature, now fully emerged, stood tall, its form an abomination of twisted, sinewy darkness, covered in that same pulsing membrane they had seen before. Its eyes glowed with an unholy light, a green that pierced through the fog and burned into Victor's soul. It moved with an eerie grace, its limbs almost fluid, like shadows given form, and as it approached, Victor found himself rooted in place, unable to move or scream. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent, their words curling around his thoughts like tendrils. "Join us," they said, the voices layered and overlapping, each promising something different: freedom, power, the end of pain. Victor could see his colleagues behind the creature, their faces blank, eyes glazed over, each of them standing still, entranced, as if they were puppets with their strings cut. João was there too, his mouth moving silently, repeating the same words over and over, his face a mask of despair. Suddenly, the creature lunged forward, its shadowy hand reaching out and grasping Victor's chest. He felt an icy pain, unlike anything he had ever experienced, a freezing fire that spread through his body, rooting him to the spot. The world around him twisted, the fog swirling in unnatural patterns, and Victor felt himself being pulled forward, towards the pit, towards the abyss that seemed to open up beneath him. The creature's grip tightened, and Victor saw flashes, visions of his life, of his past, his family, all twisted into grotesque parodies, their faces melting into shadow, their eyes accusing him, blaming him for what he had unleashed. He fought to wake up, his mind screaming against the overwhelming force that was dragging him down. He could feel the earth crumbling beneath his feet, the pit widening, swallowing everything in its path. His colleagues, Joao, the machinery, all of it began to fall into the dark void, and Victor knew that if he didn't wake up now, he would be lost forever. He summoned every ounce of strength he had, focusing on the only thing that still seemed real, the pounding of his heart, the rhythm of life that he clung to desperately. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, Victor awoke. He gasped for air, his body drenched in cold sweat, his heart racing wildly. He looked around, disoriented, the darkness of his tent pressing in on him, feeling almost as suffocating as the fog from his nightmare. His chest burned, the pain lingering, and when he pulled up his shirt, he saw it, an imprint dark and bruised, in the shape of a hand, as if the creature had truly touched him, leaving a mark that went beyond mere dreams. Victor staggered out of his tent, needing air, needing to see that it had all been just a nightmare. But as he emerged, the camp was eerily quiet. The fog had rolled in again, thick and impenetrable, and the work lamps barely cast any light, their glow swallowed by the mist. Victor's heart sank when he saw Joao, standing at the edge of the pit, just as he had in the dream. His posture was rigid, his eyes vacant, staring into the darkness below. Victor approached cautiously, his hands trembling, the memory of the nightmare still vivid in his mind. "Joao," he called out, his voice breaking the silence, echoing in the emptiness. Joao didn't respond, didn't even flinch. Victor reached out, his hand hovering over Joao's shoulder, afraid to touch him, afraid of what might happen if he did. And then Joao turned, his eyes locking onto Victor's, and in that instant Victor knew it wasn't Joao looking at him anymore. Those weren't his eyes. They were the creature's, filled with the same cold, calculating malice, the same inhuman glow. A chilling smile spread across Joao's face, his lips parting to whisper the words Victor dreaded most. "It's too late. We're already part of it." And before Victor could react, Joao stepped backward into the pit, his body swallowed by the darkness below, disappearing without a sound. Victor felt his legs give way, collapsing to his knees at the edge. Staring into the void, the whispers rising once more, louder than ever, filling his mind, promising that this was only the beginning. The world around Victor seemed to warp, the boundary between reality and the nightmare crumbling. He felt the ground beneath him shift, a vibration that seemed to pulse in time with the bruised imprint on his chest. The creature's mark was still there, a connection that linked him to whatever lay beneath, an unbreakable bond. He could feel it now, moving beneath the earth, its presence expanding, reaching out, and he realized with a growing horror that it was no longer just a nightmare. It was real, and it was spreading. Victor was no longer certain where the nightmare ended and where reality began. Every waking hour was haunted by what he had seen, the vividness of the dreams bleeding into his days. He couldn't escape the feeling that something had been set in motion, something unstoppable. The imprint on his chest remained, dark and throbbing, a constant reminder that whatever they had awakened had left its mark on him. It was as if the creature had claimed a piece of his soul, and it wasn't about to let go. The day after Joao's disappearance, Victor took it upon himself to investigate further. He scoured through old documents and archives, desperate to understand what they had uncovered. The local village nearby, forgotten and mostly abandoned, was his next stop. The townsfolk avoided the excavation area, whispering among themselves, their faces etched with fear whenever he mentioned what they had found. It was there, in a dusty, neglected library, that Victor came across an ancient manuscript, a journal kept by one of the original settlers of the area. The journal was filled with strange symbols, sketches of a creature that matched the one Victor had seen. The entries spoke of something that lived beneath the earth, a being that fed off the minds of those who came too close. It described rituals to keep the creature asleep, to prevent it from crossing over into their world. The settlers had known the danger, and they had warned future generations to never dig too deep, to leave the darkness untouched. But those warnings had been forgotten, buried under decades of progress and ignorance. One entry in particular made Victor's blood run cold. The creature marks those it chooses, binds them to its will. They become its eyes, its hands, serving it even beyond the grave. He realized that Joao had been more than just a victim. He had been claimed, used as an instrument to further the creature's reach. And Victor himself, with the bruise still throbbing on his chest, was marked too. He was becoming a part of it, whether he wanted to or not. Returning to the camp, Victor noticed something he hadn't before. His colleagues were acting even stranger, their eyes unfocused, their movements sluggish. They all seemed to be in a trance, as if they were sleepwalking, their minds somewhere far away. One of them, Sophia, was sitting by the fire, her gaze fixed on the flames, her lips moving silently. Victor moved closer, straining to hear what she was saying. Her voice was barely a whisper, repeating the same phrase over and over. "The darkness is hungry. It will take us all." He tried to shake her out of it, his hands gripping her shoulders, but her eyes never met his. They were empty, devoid of any recognition. It was as if she were no longer there, her body merely a shell, her mind consumed by something far darker. Victor felt a chill settle over him, a realization that the creature wasn't just haunting their dreams. It was taking them, one by one, breaking their minds, turning them into extensions of itself. Desperation drove Victor back to the pit that night. He had to see it again, had to confront whatever it was, had to find a way to sever the connection before it was too late. The fog had returned, thicker than ever, swirling around the excavation site like a living entity, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The pit seemed to pulse, a dark heart beating beneath the earth, each throb resonating through Victor's entire body, matching the rhythm of the bruise on his chest. He peered into the abyss, the fog parting just enough for him to see something moving down below. It wasn't just the creature. He could see figures, shadowy and indistinct, reaching up towards him. Joao was there, and Sophia, and others, their faces twisted, their mouths moving silently in unison. Victor's breath caught in his throat as he realized they were calling to him, beckoning him to join them, their voices a chorus of despair and hunger. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted, the edge of the pit crumbling, and Victor felt himself sliding forward, the darkness rushing up to meet him. He scrambled, his fingers digging into the loose dirt, his heart pounding in his ears. He could hear the whispers, louder now, almost deafening, promising an end to the fear, an end to the struggle. "Let go," they said. "Join us, and you will be free." With every ounce of strength he had left, Victor pulled himself away from the edge, rolling onto his back, gasping for breath. He lay there, staring up at the sky, the fog swirling above him, and he knew that this was far from over. The creature had awakened, and it had already begun to spread its influence. The others were lost, their minds claimed, their bodies mere extensions of its will. And he was next. The mark on his chest burned, a constant reminder of the connection that bound him to the darkness below. As Victor stood, his legs trembling, he made a decision. He would not let it take him without a fight. He would find a way to sever the bond, to end this nightmare before it consumed him completely. But as he looked around at the fog-covered camp, the shadows moving just beyond his vision, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was already too late, that the creature had already taken root in his mind, and that his fate was sealed. Victor knew he couldn't face this alone. He needed answers, something more than ancient writings and cryptic whispers. There had to be someone who understood what this creature was, how to stop it before it fully consumed him and his team. That's when he remembered the old man from the nearby village, Hans, a recluse who had lived in the shadow of the forest his entire life. The villagers had spoken of him in hushed tones, referring to him as the last keeper of old secrets. If anyone knew the truth, it would be Hans. The journey to Hans's cabin took Victor through dense, winding paths of the Black Forest. As he walked, the woods seemed to close in on him, the trees twisting unnaturally, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching down, brushing against his shoulders. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, and every step seemed to echo with an unnatural silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The fog that had plagued the excavation site had followed him, clinging to the ground like a living entity, shifting and swirling around his feet, almost as if guiding him deeper into the darkness. Victor finally reached the cabin, a structure that looked as old as the forest itself, its walls covered in moss, and its windows dark and foreboding. He hesitated for a moment, a chill running down his spine as he approached the door. He could feel the bruise on his chest throb painfully, a reminder of the creature's hold on him. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door, the sound echoing unnaturally in the silence. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing Hans, his face lined with age and his eyes sharp, as if he had seen the horrors of the world and survived them. Hans looked at Victor for a long moment before stepping aside, gesturing for him to enter. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by candles, the air thick with the smell of herbs and something metallic, blood perhaps. Victor felt a sense of unease settle over him, as if he had stepped into a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was fragile, easily shattered. Hans motioned for Victor to sit at a wooden table, his eyes never leaving the bruise on Victor's chest. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Hans's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that made Victor's heart sink. He nodded, the words caught in his throat. Hans's gaze darkened, and he began to speak of the creature, an entity from a time before mankind, a being that thrived on the minds of those who dared disturb its slumber. "It doesn't kill you outright," Hans explained, his voice trembling slightly. "It makes you part of it. It takes your thoughts, your fears, and uses them to spread its reach." Victor listened, a cold dread seeping into his bones as Hans spoke of the rituals the settlers had used to keep the creature contained. The rituals required a sacrifice, a life for a life. That was how the settlers had managed to bind it, to keep it trapped beneath the earth for so many centuries. But now they had broken that seal, and the creature was free, feeding on the minds of those who had awakened it. Victor felt his stomach churn as Hans's words sank in. There was only one way to end this nightmare. Someone had to go back into the pit, to confront the creature directly, and sacrifice themselves to seal it away once more. The very thought of returning to that place made Victor's blood run cold. He could still feel the creature's eyes on him, still hear the whispers that haunted his dreams. He knew what it wanted, knew that it was drawing him back, luring him in with promises of an end to the pain, to the fear. He looked to Hans, the desperation clear in his eyes. "There has to be another way," he pleaded, his voice cracking. But Hans only shook his head, his expression grim. "There is no other way. It will take all of you if you don't act soon." Victor left the cabin with a heavy heart, the weight of what he had to do pressing down on him like a leaden shroud. The forest seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, and he could feel the creature's presence, a constant, oppressive force that followed him, whispering at the edges of his mind. As he made his way back to the camp, Victor saw the figures in the fog, his colleagues, their faces twisted and blank, their eyes empty. They were no longer themselves, merely extensions of the creature's will, and he knew that time was running out. Back at the camp, the atmosphere was suffocating, the fog thick and impenetrable. The other workers moved like ghosts, their eyes glazed, their bodies stiff, as if they were being puppeteered by unseen strings. Victor watched as Sophia stood at the edge of the pit, her lips moving in that same silent chant, her eyes wide and unseeing. He knew he had to act now, before they were all lost. He could feel the pull of the creature, the whispers growing louder, telling him to let go, to surrender. With shaking hands, Victor began to prepare. He gathered what he could, tools, a lantern, a length of rope. He knew this was a journey from which he might not return, but he had no choice. If he didn't go back into the pit, if he didn't face the creature, it would take all of them, one by one, until nothing remained but the darkness. As he stood at the edge of the pit, looking down into the abyss, he could see the faint glow of the creature's eyes staring back at him, filled with malice, filled with hunger. Victor took a deep breath, the air thick with the stench of decay, and began his descent. The rope felt like a lifeline, but he knew it was tenuous at best. Below him, the darkness seemed alive, shifting and pulsing, the whispers growing louder with each step he took. He could feel the creature's presence all around him, could feel it reaching into his mind, twisting his thoughts, trying to break him. But Victor held on, focusing on the only thing that mattered, ending this nightmare, once and for all. As he reached the bottom, the fog parted, revealing the creature in all its terrible glory. It was no longer just a shadow, but a monstrous, pulsating form, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. The whispers filled Victor's head, deafening, promising him release, an end to the suffering. For a moment, he hesitated, the weight of fear almost too much to bear. But then he saw them, Joao, Sophia, the others, all of them standing in the darkness, their eyes empty, their faces twisted in pain. They were lost, but he was not yet. Victor took a step forward, his heart pounding, and faced the creature. The darkness closed in, the fog swallowing him whole, and he knew that whatever happened next, he would not let it win without a fight. Victor's descent into the pit was like falling into the maw of an unholy abyss. The darkness swallowed him, and the fog twisted around his body like cold, spectral fingers, pulling him further down. The whispers grew louder, forming words, each one more horrifying than the last. They called his name over and over, their voices shifting between the tones of his colleagues, his family, and even his own. It was as if the creature knew every fear he had ever harbored, every doubt that had ever crossed his mind, and it was using them to break him from within. At the bottom of the pit, the air was dense, thick with an ancient decay that seemed to cling to his skin. Victor's lantern cast a dim, flickering light, barely pushing back the darkness that surrounded him. The ground was slick with mud and something far more sinister, a black, viscous substance that pulsed in time with the beat of his heart. He could feel it underfoot, alive, reacting to his presence, as if the entire pit was an extension of the creature itself. In the center of the pit stood the creature, its form now almost humanoid, but grotesque and distorted, covered in that black, pulsating membrane. Its eyes were the same vivid, unnatural green, glowing in the darkness, fixed on Victor. The air seemed to thrum with power, the whispers now a chorus, filling the pit with an unbearable noise. Victor could see the figures behind it, Joao, Sophia, Carlos, and the others, all of them standing motionless, their eyes vacant, their bodies pale and emaciated. They were no longer themselves. They had become vessels for the creature's will, hollowed out and used. The creature moved closer, and Victor felt an icy chill radiate from it, seeping into his bones. He gripped the length of rope in his hand, his heart pounding, every muscle in his body screaming for him to run. But he knew there was nowhere to run. This was where it had to end, here, in the pit where they had awakened the terror that had been hidden for centuries. The whisper shifted, becoming more distinct, the creature's voice cutting through the cacophony. "You are already mine, Victor," it hissed, its voice echoing in his mind. "You have always been mine." Victor felt a sudden sharp pain in his chest, the bruise burning as if it were on fire. He stumbled, falling to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel the creature reaching into his mind, the shadows pressing in, trying to pull him under, trying to make him one of them. He saw flashes of his past, his childhood, his family, the moments that defined him, all twisted into dark, distorted versions, each vision more horrific than the last. His mother's face, her eyes hollow, her mouth twisted into a scream. His colleagues, their hands clawing at their faces, blood streaming down as they tried to tear away the creature's influence. He knew he had only moments before he would be lost completely. Victor forced himself to his feet, his legs trembling, and looked at the creature, its eyes boring into his soul. He reached for the small vial that Hans had given him, a mixture of herbs and something else, something ancient and powerful, meant to sever the creature's hold. It was the only chance he had, the only way to break the bond and seal the creature away once more. His hands shook as he uncorked the vial, the pungent smell filling the pit, a sharp contrast to the decay around him. The creature recoiled, its eyes narrowing, and Victor could hear its anger, the whispers rising in a deafening crescendo, trying to drown out his thoughts, trying to break his will. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on the creature, and with a scream that echoed through the pit, he hurled the contents of the vial at its feet. The liquid splashed across the ground, and the reaction was immediate. The black, viscous substance began to writhe, smoke rising as it sizzled and burned, the air filling with the acrid stench of something ancient and evil being undone. The creature let out a shriek, a sound that pierced Victor's ears, filled with fury and pain. The ground beneath them began to shake, the walls of the pit trembling, dirt and stones raining down from above. Victor felt the earth shift beneath his feet, the pit collapsing, and he knew he had to get out. Now. He turned, scrambling towards a rope, his hands slipping on the wet, muddy surface, his heart racing as the creature's screams filled the air. Behind him, he could hear the voices of his colleagues, their cries mingling with the creature's, their bodies convulsing as the bond was severed. Victor didn't look back. He couldn't. He focused on the rope, on the dim light above, on the only chance he had of escaping the nightmare that was closing in around him. His fingers found the rope, and he began to climb, his muscles aching, every inch feeling like an eternity as the pit continued to collapse, the fog swirling around him, trying to pull him back. He could feel the creature's rage, a force pressing against him, trying to drag him down. The whispers were fading, but they were still there, still calling his name, promising him freedom, promising him an end to the pain if he would just let go. But Victor didn't let go. He climbed hand over hand until finally he reached the edge of the pit, pulling himself up and collapsing on the ground, gasping for breath. The pit below was a maelstrom of darkness, the fog twisting and writhing, the creature's form barely visible, its eyes now dim, fading into the abyss. Victor watched as the earth closed in, the pit sealing itself, the creature's screams growing fainter until they were nothing more than an echo, a distant memory. The fog began to dissipate, the air growing still, and for the first time, in what felt like an eternity, Victor felt a sense of calm wash over him. He lay there, staring up at the sky, the stars just beginning to peek through the darkness, and he knew that the battle was over. The creature had been sealed away, its hold on him broken. But as he looked at the bruise on his chest, now a faint mark, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the end. The creature was still there, somewhere, waiting, watching. And he knew that as long as he lived, he would carry a part of it with him, a reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the earth, waiting to be awakened once more. Victor had survived, but the ordeal was far from over. He sat at the edge of the pit, his breath finally steadying, but there was a strange silence that enveloped the entire area, an unnatural stillness that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. The fog had dissipated, and the others who had been claimed by the creature lay scattered around the camp, unconscious but alive. Their expressions were blank, their bodies limp, as if whatever had controlled them had simply let go. But Victor knew the truth. This wasn't freedom. It was only a reprieve. He stumbled to his feet, his legs weak and shaky, and looked around the site. The pit had sealed itself, but the ground still looked wrong, like it was breathing beneath the surface, the earth pulsing slightly in a rhythm that matched the faint ache on his chest. Victor touched the mark, feeling a dull throb, a reminder that though the creature had been temporarily subdued, its connection to him had not been entirely severed. The bond had weakened, but the bruise was still there, a lingering trace of the nightmare he had faced. He walked over to Sophia, kneeling beside her, his hand gently touching her shoulder. Her eyes fluttered open, vacant and confused, and she looked at him as if she were seeing him for the first time. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Victor wanted to tell her that it was over, that they were safe, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply helped her to her feet, glancing around at the others, all of them slowly coming back to consciousness. Their eyes were hollow, haunted, the memory of what had happened already fading, but Victor knew it would never truly leave them. As the crew began to gather, confusion and fear evident in their eyes, Victor could only offer them a hollow reassurance. He couldn't tell them the whole truth, that what they had unearthed wasn't gone, merely sleeping again, and that the dark presence would forever haunt this place, lying in wait for the next foolish souls to disturb it. The fog might have lifted, and the whispers might have silenced, but Victor could still feel the creature watching, lurking just beneath the surface. He could hear it faintly, a promise whispered in the dark corners of his mind. "I will return." The journey back to the village was a somber one, the crew moving slowly, dazed and disoriented. Victor led them, his eyes constantly scanning the forest around them. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch seemed magnified, the shadows between the trees growing longer, deeper. It felt as though the forest itself had become an extension of the creature, its presence woven into the very fabric of the land. When they finally reached the village, the locals watched from a distance, their expressions a mixture of fear and pity. They knew, somehow, they had always known what lay beneath the earth, what dangers waited in the darkness. Hans met Victor at the edge of the village, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the survivors. "You did what had to be done," Hans said, his voice low. "But it's not over. It will never be over." Victor nodded, the weight of those words settling over him like a heavy shroud. He had succeeded in sealing the creature, but the cost had been high, and the danger was far from gone. The bruise on his chest throbbed, and Victor knew it was a reminder that the creature's influence still lingered, that its hunger had not been sated. The crew disbanded soon after, each of them leaving the village, returning to their homes, but Victor stayed behind. He couldn't bring himself to leave, not yet. He had to know if the creature truly was sealed, if it was still calling to him from the depths of the earth. Days turned into weeks, and Victor found himself drawn back to the site of the excavation, standing at the edge of the now sealed pit, staring into the ground as if he could see through the layers of earth, see the darkness that waited below. He could still hear it sometimes late at night, the whispers, faint and distant, calling his name, promising that one day it would rise again. The villagers avoided him, their fear palpable, but Victor didn't care. He had become a guardian of sorts, watching over the place where the creature lay, knowing that it was his responsibility to keep it contained. But deep down, he knew the truth. It was only a matter of time. The creature was patient, and its hunger was eternal. It would wait, biding its time, until the seal weakened, until someone else stumbled upon it and disturbed its rest. And what would happen then? Would they be ready for it? Would they be able to fight back against the darkness? Or would they fall, just as Victor and his team had nearly fallen? He didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at him, a constant, nagging fear that he could never shake. Victor looked down at the bruise on his chest, now faded, but still visible, and he knew that the creature had left its mark on him forever. It was a part of him now, a shadow that would follow him wherever he went, a reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the earth, always watching, always waiting. As Victor turned away from the pit, the wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, he thought he heard again, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. He paused listening, his heart pounding, but the sound faded, leaving only the rustling of the leaves in its wake. Victor took a deep breath, forcing himself to move, to walk away from the pit, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still there, watching him, waiting for its chance to rise again. If you enjoyed this story, if you feel the chill of the unknown creeping up your spine, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And now, I leave you with a question. Do you think Victor truly managed to contain the darkness, Or is it only a matter of time before it breaks free again? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. And stay tuned for more tales that will keep you up at night, wondering what else might be lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for you to find it.